You want to get into cosplay, but you don't know where to start? Here are some beginner tips, I guess. I don't know. I suck at intros. I'm going to be talking about just a few tips for if you want to cosplay, but you don't know where to start. My experience is mostly with sewing, so I'm going to stick with that. But maybe in the future, I'll be able to make a video on crafting and stuff. Before I got a sewing machine, I didn't know where to start. The best way to start, how most people do, is they go thrifting. Normally you can find sometimes outfits that work perfectly for the character, and sometimes they just need a few adjustments. And you can always do like a casual wear version of your character, which is something that I like to do a lot. Remember that there's nothing wrong with closet cosplay. I feel like for some people there's a certain stigma or expectation that you have to craft everything 100% yourself. But for things like socks or shoes, not everyone has the skill set to work on those, and cosplay is meant for everyone. Just it's not just excluded to those who can sew or only those who can craft. Thrifting, being able to work a camera, makeup, or all other parts of it, posing too. You don't necessarily need to have a sewing machine to adjust clothes. What I used to do is I used to buy like those cheap like hand sewing needles that you get at the dollar store, and I would sew things like I'll hem it to make it the right length, or I've even painted a costume before, which I don't necessarily suggest for fabric unless if you have paint specifically meant for fabrics. That's something that I would do. For my friend's Grell cosplay, actually, we found some shoes for cheap at Value Village, and we just painted a bunch of coats of red over it, and that worked for us. Before I start making a cosplay, I like to draw designs for them, and sometimes I go really into detail based on the separate pieces, but for the most part, I normally have like a full body outline of what I expect it to look like, and I tend to add in like certain details and textures. For example, like some parts being see-through, or some parts that I know I want to be velvet, or I want to be a more like thicker texture, or based on like the weight of the cosplay. So let's say you do have a sewing machine or you're really skilled with hand sewing. It would take a long time. I do not recommend sewing from scratch by hand a costume. When you're going to pick out fabrics for your certain character, you need to keep in mind the type of character, the era they live in, their income. For example, if you're finding a cosplay for like more rich, high society character, maybe like a princess or something, they would tend to have more expensive like fabrics, maybe like a nice velvet, or maybe something that doesn't look like a curtain or a bed sheet. You can buy bed sheets and curtains when sewing. I've done that before, but you need to keep in mind the piece you're sewing and who you're sewing it for. When choosing a cosplay, you're going to want to keep in mind the breathability, the weight, because if something's really heavy, you might not want to be carrying that around. And if the fabrics are too thin when you're sewing it, it can be hard sometimes and difficult to sew it. Sometimes the fabric won't survive through it. But there was this one time when I was going to Fan Expo, my CL cosplay, it had this really heavy, thick, long cape, and it was really, really hot out. We had to walk to the convention from the place we were staying at. So throughout the entire walk, we were just through this sweating heat. And even inside of the convention, since there were so many people, it was really, really hot. That's something that I regret, as well as my cape was so long that a bunch of people were stepping on it.
People kept stepping on my cape, and now I am sad.
Yeah, not fun. So when picking a cosplay, make sure you keep in mind the season, the amount of things you can do in it, like how you can move around, the flexibility, and so on. After you picked out the fabrics that you want to use, you're going to need sewing patterns. Sewing patterns is important if you are starting out because of the fact that they give you like a guideline for what you need. And if you're not familiar with sewing yet, you don't know anything, and it's like I've tried before doing things based off of like kind of feel and stuff, but that's not really something you can do until you're comfortable with sewing. Like, I made this corset belt by kind of just going with how I feel like it should look like. But when I was making these shorts, I looked up a pattern to help guide me because genuinely I was confused by what I was supposed to do. Like, if I did not have that pattern, I wouldn't have known how point A got to point B. You can always buy patterns from either your favorite creators or from your favorite sites, but also you can find free patterns online. And sometimes if you're looking for a specific character, especially if you're working with props, it's a lot more recommended to seek out a pattern. For example, you want to make horns or make like Bakugo gauntlets or something like that. Those are very specific, and if you are looking for a type of guideline, most of the time you're probably gonna have to pay for it. For free patterns, I know you can always check Pinterest. There's like an endless amount of recommendations. Reddit, you can, in certain subreddits, there are people who post about like the places they like to go for patterns. You can go to cosplaymode.net, Moved Society, I think. You can go to Berta, and there's a lot more. I'll just list them here on the screen for you can see. These are the ones that I've seen people recommend it or I've looked into myself. There are also other people that you might know that have patterns. You can always go to your local sewing place like Sew Store. They'll normally have some patterns. Something that a lot of people forget are details. Details are important because of the fact that they can really bring a cosplay to life. Like whether it be like some gold trimming or like a certain button or a certain button color or just like the placement of your cosplay overall. Sometimes things can feel very plain without those extra details. Like sometimes you can really bring it to life by adding lace. For example, you'll have a cosplay that has like this white outfit. Sometimes adding like a layer of lace on top of it can really give it the feel for the character. Off topic, an anime I really recommend watching is My Dress Up Doll Darling, because if you're looking for like a motivation to get into cosplay, I was in a really big rut, and after watching that anime it really inspired me, seeing like how they pick the details for the cosplays and their process of creating a cosplay, which is something that I can really like feel for, you know? If you ever want more tips, like this video and subscribe. Oh, it started recording.